Hello everyone, my name is David Andrejek. I'm a student in the class EPS 511 at National Louis University. And I am going to be speaking today about Chapter 12 of the book, Educational Psychology Reflections for Action. Chapter 12 specifically is about individual differences and special needs. And under those categories, we'll be covering three main topics. Intelligence, or the concept of intelligence, talent and how it's developed, and then finally children with special needs. So starting on the topic of intelligence, we're just going to talk very briefly about some of the early history of intelligence. Intelligence is described as a theoretical concept to understand the world. If you go back to the philosopher Plato, he said intelligence was one of the three parts of the soul, with the other two being will and appetite. And if you want to talk about two of the most important early scholars regarding intelligence, that would be Alfred Binet and Francis Galton. So Galton was actually a relative of Charles Darwin, and he was the pioneer of individual differences. And he actually was the first to apply a Gaussian distribution to human characteristics. So specifically regarding intelligence, what that means, if the bottom axis is a measurement of intelligence, where more intelligence is going to my right or to my left, depending, and the population of people or number of people is going up, a Gaussian distribution would be like this, where a middle of the road intelligence or average intelligence would cover the most amount of people. And then here at the extremes, the most intelligent and least intelligent, you would have the smallest number of people. Now, one of the interesting aspects of Galton is that this idea of his, which is actually correct, but it led him to the idea that if you take people in the upper echelon of this, and they are the ones who continue to propagate the species, that you would get a super intelligent human race, and that's ultimately eugenics. Which is now looked upon very unfavorably. And then next we'll talk about Binet. Binet, who is a French scholar, he was tasked with finding children with lower amounts of intelligence that could be moved to special schools. So he was the first to develop a bunch of scales basically for measuring student performance to weed out, so to speak, the lower students. And his criteria was what he described as common sense. Questions might range from which line is longer, repeat these numbers that I say, point to this certain part of your body. And with a large enough sample size of students, he was able to develop a scale that said, for this age of student, you should be able to understand this much. And the ones who fell below that, or I should say much below that, were the ones sent to the alternate schools. So that concludes my section on intelligence, or the history of intelligence, and this is covered in the textbook pages 415 and 416. So now, next, let's talk about talent. Talent is defined as the capacity to produce exceptional performance. Now, some believe that talent is just an innate gift, but studies have actually shown that talent is developed with practice and more experience. So I should say that practice lends to talent. Now, not in the textbook, but an interesting tidbit that I know is that the author Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called Outliers, where he talked about exceptional people and how they got that way. He talked about Bill Gates. He talked about the Beatles. He talked about several others. And one of the things he said is these people all became exceptionally talented because they developed their talent nonstop. Bill Gates basically had access to a super high speed connection, very high speed connection to the web, given his time of being in the youth, or the timing of period of time it was. And he just developed it and developed it and developed it. Same thing with the Beatles. They'd play all the time, and that's how these people became great. And in that book, they actually postulate that if you develop 10,000 hours to a certain skill, you will become an expert. Anyway, getting back to our textbook. So there is a basic model for how talent is developed. And I will briefly jot that down. So when you talk about any new skill for a student, it's introduced. And then the normal person will develop the skill until it's good enough. That's what most of us do for most everything. And then it just becomes routine. And then it stops. The dotted line represents what most of us do. However, some people, they have a desire to improve. So this starts the non-dotted line. And that desire to improve is fueled by three things. One of them is enjoyment. If you enjoy something, you will want to do it more. The second is just the internal value you give to it, just for the sake of being better at it. And the third would be external support, which might be a parent encouraging you, or access, as in the Bill Gates example, access to something that most people may not have. So these three lead to the desire to improve. And from there, what we have is deliberate practice. And deliberate practice takes the form of 4 different activities. One of them is task refinement. So when you're playing the violin, specific tasks that you do to improve your performance. Another one is self-reflection. This is you thinking about, how can I improve? How can I do this better? What can I do different? Next is coaching and feedback, because all the best people in a given talent generally have someone who taught them and provided them with feedback. And finally is observing. Observing other people doing this thing that you would like to get better at. So this concludes my overview of TIP. So now let me move on to the final part of the chapter, which is children with special needs. Now this is a very large topic, but I'm just going to briefly overview different types of special needs that are commonly encountered in the classroom. So due to changing laws and methods of operation, teachers now encounter more children with special needs in their regular class. In fact, about 99% of children with special needs are immersed into the regular classroom. So you could imagine that all teachers will experience this at some point. And the most prevalent categories of children with special needs would be learning disabilities, attention disorders, and autism. So I will briefly cover all of those. Learning disability is basically invisible. And bad performance in any given class may or may not be due to an actual learning disability. But there's three broad categories of learning disabilities. One of them is a speech or language or articulation disability, and often these could be fixed with therapy. Another one would be considered achievement or academic skills disorder, or disability, and the last one would be general category of everything else. So moving on, now we have, we'll talk about autism. Now, autism was categorized as its own or put in its own separate category starting back in 1990. And autism is identified or described by having extreme social withdrawal, deficiency in cognitive processing, and then also language disorders. And finally, we'll talk about attention disorders, which fall into two broad categories. One of them is attention deficit, also known as ADD, and that is described as a difficulty with attention span, impulsiveness, and sometimes hyperactivity. And this is considered an emotional disorder, not a disability. And then the other one, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, it actually has a lot of the same issues as ADD, such as difficulty with attention and impulsiveness, but there is more emphasis placed on the hyperactivity, and it is more intense. And it's also described as being the behavior is inconsistent with the student's age. Now, this portion of the my teach back is covered on pages 435 to 440. And I forgot to mention when I was discussing talent that was covered on page 423 to 424 of the textbook. So this concludes my brief overview of chapter 12. I hope you enjoyed it.